Audio made possible by www.jackettome.com. Warning. The following has suggested content that is not suitable for some listeners. Audio Fanfiction Productions presents Wide Awake. Fanfiction written by Angskata003. Fanfiction inspired by the Twilight Saga written by Stephanie Meyer. Chapter 37. Mysterious Mousse Melodies. Bella's point of view. 5 days since Valentine's Day. 5 beautifully perfect days and nights, where everything fit and everything fell into place with an unbelievable precision and grace. Edward and I were smug and smitten with rarely an issue arising. It was like floating on a cloud. And now there were tears trailing down my red cheeks as I sat on my bed, inside the room I never used, and watched Esme pace in front of me with her head down and her brows furrowed deeply. I shifted my gaze down to my lap, noting the blue flannel pajama pants I hadn't even removed yet, and bit my lip hard to suppress the sob threatening to escape. I was wondering where everything went so terribly wrong. This whole mess must have been my entire fault. Edward was probably beating himself up about it at that very moment as he sat next door, but he wasn't the one to blame. Maybe no one was to blame. Maybe it was just another one of those cosmic events that sought me out to destroy my serenity. As if the universe could see how happy and content I was, and it decided that just wouldn't do. I sighed deeply into my lap, and eased myself down onto my back, lifting my hands up to cover my face, while I allowed my thoughts to drift to the morning after Valentine's Day. There's nothing like waking up next to the person you love after a long night of unicorn-induced coma. There was no awkwardness between Edward and me, just sleepy-eyed glances, and lazy grins as we kissed at the doorway, and our tongues intermingled languidly. Comfortably. Alice drove me to school, offering me the PG version of her night with Jasper, which ended up being no more than 3 sentences. I was guessing the R-rated version would take hours to recite because she looked downright exhausted, likely having stayed up the entire night, and come home so early for the sake of appearances. When we arrived at school, Edward stood casually against his car waiting for me, sending me a lopsided grin as he pushed off his door and strode lively to me. He had a little scratch on his nose that made me work an eyebrow at him before he put his arm around my shoulder and blanketed me in his electricity. He just narrowed his eyes in Jasper's direction and walked me to class. Despite the apparently Jasper-induced nose grace, even Edward seemed happy as we walked the halls. It was a subtle thing that the casual observer wouldn't take time to notice, but he wasn't glaring at anyone. He was just looking straight ahead, and steering me around him silently. Lunch that day threatened to ruin the perfection streak, however. Edward had walked me to the lunchroom like he always did. But as we reached the table where everyone else was already seated, all eyes turned to us. Emmett arched one dark eyebrow while his arm hung lazily over Rose's petite shoulders.
"What happened to your nose?"
he asked in a generally curious tone, leaning his chair back on 2 legs precariously. Edward grunted and sat us down in our usual spot, narrowing his eyes once again at the individual occupying the seat in front of him.
"Fucking Jess's stupid ass,"
he grumbled, glowering at Jasper, while I moved close to his side, like always. Suddenly his whole body stiffened, gaining my attention as I peeked up at him and removed my hood. He groaned softly, leaning his head back and closing his eyes as if he were bracing himself for something. And when nothing happened, he opened one eye, casting it at Rose, who sat reading a book and tapping a pencil on the wooden tabletop in a gesture of boredom. He snorted.
"What the fuck, Hale? I basically handed you that one on a silver platter,"
he asked incredulously while his hand came up to stroke my neck tenderly. He eyed her in confusion for a moment before she finally met his gaze. She simply shrugged. "Too easy," she sighed indifferently. I was nervous then, because I knew Rose. There was no way she'd pass that one up in a million years just because it was too easy. It was a beautiful setup. And she passed on it because she somehow felt differently about Edward. And I was the reason for that. He looked skeptical, but relieved the joke was left alone. Emmett appeared to be having a hard time with restraining himself, but did nonetheless, as we all sat and ate our cookies in casual conversation. It was a close call, and later that day, when I got her and Alice alone, I told them in so many words to stop acting so weird around him. I knew what it felt like to be treated differently because of my past, and I refused to watch it happen to Edward too. I think Rose and Alice understood where I was coming from. That night, the wait began for the right feeling to arise. Not the right moment, or place, or reason. All of those things already existed for us, we were just waiting for it to feel right. Monday night was not that night. I think we were probably too tense and anxious about it feeling right to actually experience it. And we were okay with that, just going to bed instead of fooling around and trying to force it. It didn't ruin the feeling of perfection the following day, as we walked the halls arm in arm and ate lunch with the group. It just was. And Tuesday night, when I climbed up the lattice with a sore neck from a rather unfortunate and clumsy incident in gym, we knew it still didn't feel right. So instead of fooling around, Edward pulled me up against him with my back to his chest and gave me the most Edwardly neck massage I could have ever hoped for. He leaned against my ear and chuckled when I hummed and moaned and melted into his warm touch. I couldn't help it. It was the only massage I had ever received. Women could still touch me while I lived in Phoenix, sure. But what woman wanted to give a 17-year-old girl a neck massage, or a hug, or a kiss? After I moved in with Esme, I'd get the occasional sporadic hand pat, but before Edward, it was so rare for me to have any affection at all, let alone a lingering, massaging kind. I told him so when I began feeling rather mortified by my dramatic reaction to his sensual ministrations. His hands halted on my shoulders and I could feel his hair tickling my ear as I lounged between his legs on the bed, and made my confession.
That's pretty fucked up,
he whispered in response, turning his face to the side of my head, and kissing it tenderly affectionately before resuming the rubbing. I was going to shrug and make it seem less so by saying something like I never preferred it anyways, but he would never buy it. Because it was a lie. Wednesday night was spent doing a lengthy biology project that we had both been avoiding like the plague since the previous week. Textbooks and assignment papers were strewn across his large bed carelessly while we lay side by side on our stomachs, so close our arms were touching. We flipped through the pages of our shared textbook, and wrote our papers in silence, occasionally lifting our bare feet in the air and tangling them between us with quick sideways glances and small grins as I chewed the end of my pen and leaned closer. It was so disgustingly cheesy, I blushed. I loved every second of it. I was so positive Thursday night was going to be ours. Edward seemed fine all day in school. Better than fine, actually. He smiled nearly every moment I was at his side. He even contributed a dirty joke at the lunch table. His comfort took everyone by surprise, as he stroked my neck, and snickered in unison with Emmett and Jasper. But when he opened his balcony doors for me that night, he looked off. There was no crease between his eyes, so I knew it wasn't related to his past, but there was an obvious change in his mood from earlier in the day. The misty breeze fluttered through his hair gently, and the soft contrast it gave emphasized the air of tension about him. The muscles in his arms were taut and twitching, and his jaw appeared clenched as he offered me a tight grin that didn't reach his eyes. The flare in his nostrils and the way he breathed deeply as if trying to calm himself made me realize that this was anger. In fact, all of those signs coupled with the dark flash in his green eyes as he gazed at me signaled downright infuriation. I peeked at him warily as I made my way past his rigid form and into the warm room. There were no words spoken, and he barely looked at me as I unloaded his food and removed my hoodie glumly. He ate as if he didn't have an appetite, and he gripped his fork with an unnecessary amount of strength, while his eyes remained tight and darkened with an ire I was oblivious of. The climate of the room was darkened and tense with the unease of the unspoken hostility he was seething. It made me so anxious with its inflection, that I restrained myself from leaning on his stiff shoulders as I usually would. He noticed this after so long, and the way he sighed heavily without meeting my gaze, and draped his arm across my shoulder affectionately reassured me that this anger wasn't directed at me. I was awfully tempted to pry for some explanation as I gazed at him in utter confusion, but I knew as soon as he finished eating and got ready for bed, that I wasn't privy to this particular knowledge. So I let it go, and tried to ease him with my soft caress, as we lay in bed, and prepared for sleep. It was gone by the following morning, as he kissed me by the door, so I reasoned that it must not have been so bad. Though, deep down I knew, Edward was the type to hold grudges, and if it were a particular individual he was so belligerent with, they wouldn't get off so easy. But, that day, his anger was gone, as he smiled crookedly at me in the parking lot of the school. And as such, the day was unhindered for the most part. But, there was this little issue I was having as I walked the halls with Edward. A song. One of those irritating tunes that linger in your periphery no matter the lack of attention you grant it. The worst part was I couldn't figure out what song it was. There were no words, just little fragments that danced around in my head. It pestered me through every class and assignment. On the ride home with Alice, I had become rather peeved with it, flipping through the radio and choosing some vulgar gangster rap in hopes it would drive the song away. Because I was thinking gangster rap tends to do that. But even as Alice grimaced and drove faster through the booming bass of the song, I realized there was no hope. Now the sweet little tune had just acquired lyrics about bitches and hoes as it echoed in my brain. It would have been humorous if it weren't so freaking annoying. It lingered the entire evening as I cooked and baked my mysterious Mousse Melodies. It had somehow wiggled its way so far into the significance of my day, that it had become a cookie name. It was even there as I tapped on the glass balcony doors to Edward's room. Even my concern that his rage would reappear didn't force it away. He seemed fine that night however. No creases or tension as I walked into the room with a relieved, albeit distracted smile. I read, while he ate, deciding that the suspenseful climax my book had reached would keep my thoughts occupied. But it was still freaking there. My eyes slowly drifted to the wall across the room as I gazed off into space, and tried with more effort to place the name of the annoying tune. Surely, once I knew what it was called the lure would disappear. It was then that I began humming it aloud. I'm not sure what compelled the notion that hearing it aloud would help any, but I did it. I pursed my lips, while I hummed quietly, occasionally furrowing my brows and tilting my head. Once I hit a note that seemed familiar to me, I was so lost in my attempts to mold it into something comprehensible that I hadn't even realized Edward could hear me. My eyes slowly drifted to his, finally remembering his was in the room as well. But once my gaze landed on his face, my gentle humming was halted abruptly. Edward was glaring at me, those dark green eyes narrowed, as he put the cover on his container and tossed it aside wordlessly. My heart lurched, and my stomach churned. This anger was directed me. As me's distressed sigh brought me back to the present as I lay on my bed with my palms covering my tear-stained face. I want the truth, Bella. She spoke in a firm and authoritative voice as she stood in front of my bed. A voice that I had never heard as me